welcome back to another episode of DSC's Charity Questions. And we love having exciting guests with us today. And today we have three guests with us, and we all work for DSC. It's a DSC podcast today, and we're talking about a really exciting piece of research that we've just completed at DSC called Grants for Good. And so I've got three of our researchers with us today. I've got Jay, Rhiannon, and Chester. So why don't you introduce yourselves? Go on, Jay.
Hi, Jay Kennedy. I'm the Director of Policy and Research here at DSC.
Awesome.
Hello.
Welcome,
Sorry.
Jay.
Hi, I'm Rhiannon. I'm Research Coordinator here at Directory of Social Change.
Awesome.
Hi everyone, I'm Chester and I'm a Senior Researcher here at DSC.
Perfect. So I must say I'm anxious to learn a little bit more about this as well, because of course I know a little bit about this from working at DSC, but I get this great opportunity to learn even more now. And of course, for the listeners out there, we want to understand, why did we do this research? So Jay, what made us approach this in the first place?
Yeah, well, this topic is something that's kind of been, it's important for many charities in the country and other types of voluntary organizations, and has been for some time. Personally, it's something I started researching almost 20 years ago, looking at kind of the types of government funding for charities in the UK. And ever since I started working on this 20 years ago, it's been a challenge in terms of the transparency and lack of data about how much money the government provides to the charity sector, and where it comes from and where it goes. And in particularly with respect to local authority funding, which is kind of over the last few decades remained an important component of lots of kind of the funding mix, if you like, for local voluntary organizations. But there's a lack of kind of clarity about kind of how it's changed and how the trends have been over time. So we've been active with other partners in the sector to try to campaign for that to be maintained and increased if possible, and to have better practice around it. So that's really what this research is about today.
Nice. So we're talking about local government funding, is that right?
Yeah. And over the past few decades, and this report kind of lays out the story of how things have changed during that period, and the various kind of policy developments that have impacted on that. But there's been a shift from local authorities providing kind of grants for particular charities to support services, to including them more in kind of commissioning and contract and procurement regulations. And that's had some impacts both on the amount of funding and the ability of local organizations to kind of win that work, if you like. And so that's really, we're trying to illuminate some of those details with data.
Nice. And that's it sometimes, isn't it? This collection of data. Is there a charity out there that can do that? I'm glad that we're in this kind of position. And looking back, we've obviously done a lot of research in the past, quite deep into the armed forces sector, things like that. But in terms of local funding, local government funding, have we done anything like this before?
We have at various points in the past, tried to kind of research and analyze and enlighten and elucidate, if you like. The difficulty is that there's so many local governments, and one problem that this report kind of highlights is there's just a lack of consistency in data and lack of transparency, despite the fact that over recent decades there have been a number of initiatives to try to improve that, to put more data in the public domain, particularly specifically about what goes to charities and voluntary organizations, with limited success. So it's kind of been a case of kind of rolling that boulder uphill and sort of slow progress, and we're trying to kind of push the pace a bit harder, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're definitely going to talk very shortly about what local governments are doing now. But if we look to the past, is there anything that kind of summarizes what local governments were like in the past?
Yeah, well, as I say, there's kind of a few different eras, if you like, a few different periods, I suppose. I mean, really, a lot of this, the way that local government funded the voluntary sector has changed a lot in the last 30 years, and I think probably between sort of 2000 and 2010 was a period where there was more growth, but also growth in funding overall from statutory sources, including local government, to the charity sector. but also, as I say, this change in how the funding was provided from being, tending to involve more grant funding to involving more contract funding. But actually, in the decade since 2010, when we've had massive changes to public spending, and particularly the kind of amount of money that local governments get from central government, which has reduced drastically since
Absolutely.
2010, that's affected the picture. So that has changed how much funding there is available, and also put local authorities under a lot of pressure. And then most recently, really, the kind of cost of living crisis and the COVID pandemic. I think we don't have good data on that yet, but it looks like that probably coincided with a bit of an uptick, actually, in support from local government to the sector, because of the emergency of the pandemic in particular, and the kind of necessity of local governments working closely with local partners in the charity sector.
Yeah, and I think I've been a trustee in the past where we've had contracts with local government, and super important for us. So in terms of the role it played for us, it was as service level agreements to deliver services, and I think that's always been quite a strong way to have that relationship. But it's quite nice to hear that it's maybe going up, actually, which is something that I haven't necessarily heard. It's what's obviously the data is why the data is so key. But right now, what does government funding, the role, what does that play in the total kind of charity sector fundraising picture?
Well, it's, as I say, it's changed a lot, and the available data that we have shows that from a decade ago, when it was kind of like the largest chunk, or kind of pretty much almost like even with public fundraising, it's now in a very different position. And for the most recent data we've got, public fundraising has now outstripped income from the state. So a lot of people would look at that as a good thing, and see that that's kind of reflects the sort of the strength of charities, kind of reliance on the public and less on the state. But that is a big change in the kind of landscape.
Absolutely, yeah. And so let's talk about the data now. Then let's dig into this. So I know Chester and Rhiannon, you've looked at this a lot. And so, what did we find, Chester? Can you summarize this for all of our listeners out there who maybe have their own anecdotal understanding and knowledge of what's happened? But what did the data tell us?
Yeah, of course. So as Jay's alluded to, the freedom of information request that we sent out to local authorities asked about a few different things. And it's allowed us to put some important numbers on things like the total number of grants made, for example.
Nice.
And there'll be lots of detail in the report, but I thought people might be most interested today to hear about how much local authorities actually spent on their grant making to the voluntary community and social enterprise sector.
Absolutely.
So what we found was that local authorities spent around £333 million on grants to the voluntary and community sector in 2020-21, which was actually the highest of the 3 years that we asked about. So we also asked about the 2 preceding years. And the total value of grants made over that period increased by around a third, so like 33%.
Wow.
But it's important to remember that we didn't actually hear back from every single local authority that we sent our freedom of information request to. And Rhiannon will talk about this in a bit more detail later, I think, because it's an interesting finding in itself. But here, what this means is that the total is actually likely to be higher than that 333 million that I just quoted. So to give an idea of just how much higher the grant total would be, sort of if we had actually heard back from every local authority, we did some additional calculations, and if listeners are interested in the details of how we did this, then there'll be lots of detail in the report. But the key takeaway figure is that we estimate local authorities across the UK provided a total of around £630 million in grants, specifically to the voluntary community and social enterprise sector.
Wow. And that's over a year, yeah?
Yeah, so that's for 2020, 2021 for that financial year, that's right.
Fine, so this is what we're kind of thinking that COVID has potentially impacted quite significantly then?
Yeah, so that's something that we can only kind of speculate on because we don't have the detailed breakdown. It's something that we would sort of need to look at in more detail in future. So as well as that kind of like grand total, With the data that we'd collected, we're also able to investigate, for example, how much the average local authority makes in grants. So again, looking at the most recent financial year, the data showed us that, so that's 2020-21, just for clarity. The data showed us that on average, local authorities made grants worth £1.6 million. So that's £1.6 million per local authority.
Fine.
But the astute listener, and I'm sure George, you yourself might be thinking, well, what type of average are you talking about here? Because there are obviously different ways of calculating averages, and that's a really good question to have in mind, because sometimes the mean average, which is in this case where we add up everything that local authorities spent and then divide that by the number of local authorities, that can be quite different to the median average, where we line up all local authorities in terms of their size and then look at the one in the middle. So the mean average was the 1.6 million that I just quoted, but the median average, which you can loosely think about as like the typical local authority, actually only made grants worth 340,000.
Gotcha.
So in fact, 3/4 of local authorities actually allocated less than 870,000 in grants to the voluntary and community sector. So it's quite a big difference. And it actually suggests that most local authorities have a relatively small budget for grant making to the sector.
But that sounds to me then like there's some big players out there who are taking more responsibility and
Exactly, yeah. So we found that there were a handful of councils that were making a lot in terms of their value, and then quite a lot that were making quite little.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. And I guess there's massive impacts based on geography of small organizations probably feeling that as well, Chester. And it's, I guess, why sometimes you speak to somebody who has a lot of maybe frustration and then somebody that doesn't. And I guess this is what we're talking about, isn't it? These different local governments. So interesting findings then. Go on, Rhiannon. Chester's teed you up. What other interesting findings have we got from this report? Thanks, Chester.
Well, another one that springs to mind is that we also explored whether local authorities had experienced any formal complaints or legal challenges in response to their grant-making practices.
Nice.
So out of, I think, 273 responses we had to that question, only 2 had actually had any formal complaints, which is actually less than 1% of all respondents, so a tiny fraction. And actually none of those formal complaints had resulted in legal challenges. Now, this is a really interesting finding because we know that anecdotally, commissioners in local authority circles have long shied away from grant making in favour of contracts. And that is often based on perceptions that grants are in some way less legitimate than contracts, or that they violate procurement regulations, or much cited fears around them potentially leading to legal challenges. So that's a really, really interesting finding because it essentially really challenges those long-standing narratives that have been circulating within the sector.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is really interesting. And I'm just wondering, I put you 3 on the spot here. To less than 1%, how would that compare maybe to grant giving organizations, trusts and foundations? Do we have that off the top of our heads? Let's put you on the spot here, but no, go on.
I've never seen any data on complaints to foundations, but it'd be interesting to see if there were any.
I wonder how that would compare. Okay, I'll stop with my my mean questions. So
you can stay for thought for future research, so that's all good.
Absolutely. So in terms of getting the data, we were talking about, we went for a freedom of information request, which obviously is quite a good way to do it, even if only a limited number of responses. But what kind of challenges did we find collating this report?
Yeah, well, I think the first key challenge was really local authorities' lack of compliance with freedom of information regulations. So the project was heavily reliant on local authorities replying to our freedom of information response within 20 days, which is the legal requirement. We actually ended up extending the data collection period to 60 days. So that's 3 times the legal requirement. And we sent lots of follow-up reminders too to really try and boost those response rates.
Yeah.
And while we did receive data back from the majority of councils, so 3/4 responded with either full or partial data, just around a quarter actually completely ignored the request or denied the request. And again, as I think Jay will maybe discuss a little bit further later, that was one of the key recommendations of the report, that all local authorities should really be complying with the spirit of the Freedom of Information Act.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then I think one of an additional key challenge was that when local authorities did return data, it wasn't always in an accessible format. So one of the issues we found time and time again was that documents that had been forwarded by councils were mislabeled. So as a result, we had to engage in quite a lot of back and forth with the councils over email, over telephone calls, to try and address queries we had and to decipher little problems with the data. And while that approach was successful, as you can imagine, it was really time consuming on our end. So again, that does form one of our key recommendations, that when local authorities are publishing data on their grant making practices, it should be really clear, really accessible, and in a standardized format.
Nice. Yeah, and that's exactly it, isn't it? That's it. It's simple steps, isn't it? But I guess it's a step too far for some of them potentially, and I'm sure they have other challenges to be thinking about as well, which is difficult, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's pushed for time and resources.
Absolutely.
But I do think that overall the freedom of information request approach was successful, and it can be really, really useful tool for data collection. I don't think we would have seen the same rates of engagement if we had sent a survey to the councils, for example.
Yeah, I can
So
understand
overall,
that.
3/4 of councils responding, isn't a bad start, but
No,
definitely room for improvement. Yeah.
Nice, well done. And I know Rhiannon and Chester specifically a massive involvement in this. So thank you both for sharing your thoughts on that just then. So let's put it in going into our listeners' shoes then. So we've got the listeners thinking maybe, well, I could do some local government funding potentially. Maybe it could be a contract. Maybe I've got a contract and I want to talk about grant funding and switch it up. So to you then, Jay, what can our listeners do to benefit from local government funding?
Well, I think it's never going to be necessarily the easiest kind of funding to get, but is there any easy kind of funding? Probably not. I think number one is just kind of make sure that you're building the relationships and that you're showing your value in the community. And I am hopeful that actually COVID may have proved to be a bit of a turning point, and that people in local government, whether they're on the political side or officials, kind of woke up to the value of the organizations in their community that provide a lot of myriad services, but also the kind of intelligence about what's going on in the community. And I'm hopeful that can kind of start to be something positive that might come out of the recent sort of difficult times. So yeah, show your value, make sure that you're got those relationships. Navigating kind of tendering processes is always going to be difficult. There's a lot of kind of policy work being done to try to improve those things, but it's always I think it's always going to be challenging. But I think try to make the case for grants, and that's what this research from this report is designed to do. It's designed to hopefully give you some kind of arrows to your bow, really, to be kind of going into those conversations with people in local government to say, look, you know what, you're telling me that the legal team says we can't do grants, but actually there's no evidence that that's a problem. The guidance and the regulations from government clearly state that it's legitimate to make grants. They don't violate procurement rules, particularly for kind of lower value financial awards for social services. So this is intended to give you some hesitate to say ammunition, because we want to have partnership and joint working rather than warfare, but something to kind of go to those people and convince them and say, here's some data about this. Look, nobody's actually seen any examples of legal challenges to grant making. So it's something that you can do, and here's why you should do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what I'd say, really, I think.
And because it is a totally understandable perspective to be mindful of this kind of unspoken fear that maybe we will get legal claims and contracts are the way to go. But absolutely, it's just what happens when we get the data together. It just tells us a different story.
And there's no guarantee that we don't have data actually on how many contractual agreements get challenged, and it may be that's more possibly could be more frequent.
Good point.
but yeah, and I would say also just support work like this, support campaigns. If you can help get the message out, if you can help amplify,
Mm.
Read the research, share it with people, share it with people in your local community, with other charities, with people in the council. I think hopefully that's only going to help.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about where we can get the research and people can access it very shortly. So local government funding, I mean, it sounds like it's going up, right? And I know maybe COVID was an anomaly. Maybe we do this and we look at 21, 22, 22, 23 when we get the chance and it goes back down. But in the short term, in the 3 years you've looked at, it sounds like it's going up. But how do you
Well,
think, Jay, that it's going to change in the future? Go on.
well, there's some positive signs, as I say. Probably the jury's still out about whether it's definitely going up and in what types.
Mm,
I think um, the reality is local governments are continuing to be under huge pressure. So
mm,
the sort of trend that I talked about at the beginning of kind of post 2010,
mm,
every budget that I can remember looking at, local government's kind of been at the bottom of the list, and
absolutely.
so that is sort of the financial, I guess, security of local government is very much still a problem, and so we're still going to have, not an easy operating environment, convincing local government to kind of fund the voluntary sector, but it's definitely worth trying. And there's room to improve. I mean, we've talked. Chester's kind of outlined the numbers, which seem like they seem kind of impressive if you're an individual, but actually in
Mm,
the grand scheme of things, 300 million or 600 million is a drop in the bucket when it comes to total government spending. So
absolutely.
there's definitely room for improvement.
Nice. So anything, Chester, Rhiannon, did you want to add anything? Cool. Cool. Okay. So if people want to find this research, how can they do that, Jay?
It's going to be on the DSC website from the end of June. We don't have an exact launch date yet, but it'll be
Yeah.
coming out towards the end of June. So you'll be able to go on to www.dsc.org.uk and you should be able to find it there. We've got different sections of the website for research and also for policy, and it should be in both those places. And also check out our Twitter feed at DSC_charity.
Absolutely. And so if you're not on our newsletter and you want to be updated as soon as the research hits, just go onto the DSC website Jay just mentioned, dsc.org.uk. It's a little newsletter button in the top right and you can pop your email in there as well. And that will give you a direct email when the research is available for you to be one of the first to see it. And of course, yeah, it'll be on our socials and things like that. Now, Jay, I know you're active on Twitter as well, or at least we have been in the past. Do you want to share your Twitter as well, Jay, if people want to follow you?
Yeah, I'm at J Kennedy DSC. So just the letter J, then KENNEDY
Nice.
DSC.
Thank you. And then Chester, Rhiannon, are you posting on charity Twitter these days? The crazy place that is the charity world on Twitter? No, cool.
Not at the moment, no.
Not at the moment, no. Amazing. All right. Thank you all three so much for doing this research, first of all. And I think some of the things that do come out of our research is that actually, I never knew that, which is why we do it, right? And there's definitely been a few aha moments with this, and it's been great to follow along from the sidelines, but also learn a lot more today. So thank you three for joining us, Chester, Rhiannon, Jay. I really appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you everybody to our listeners as well. And good luck getting local government funding. Thank you for watching Charity Questions by the Directory of Social Change. So this is the podcast where we bring charity experts to you and we ask them the questions that you provide us via social media. So if you want to get involved, please check out the Directory of Social Change on Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. And of course, to hear more about this content and to learn more about Charity Questions, subscribe to our YouTube channel now. And of course, like this video to let us know if you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. Cheers.